Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the Melbourne Town Hall for this wonderful Wheeler Centre event launching Bob Brown's wonderful new book, Optimism. I'm incredibly thrilled to be asked to introduce Bob. I've been a very big fan and admirer of him and his work for many years. I listened to him today in one of the many interviews that he's having, where the announcer said he wears many hats: doctor, politician, activist, photographer, author. And she asked Bob how he would describe himself. And he said, "I'm a member of the 7 million people on the planet." Thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, Hamlet's words from Shakespeare, "What a piece of work is a man." That's the ideal. But to me, there are far too many wealthy and powerful men dominating public life at this moment in history who can at best be described ironically as a piece of work. Locally and globally, we seem to be embroiled in an escalating wave of cruelty, of combat, deceit, chest beating, vilification and heartlessness, of a new political correctness, which is really no political correctness at all. For me, and I suspect many others, this behaviour belongs in a kindergarten playground. And I know a bit about kindergarten playgrounds. Bullying, bellicose, belligerent, belittling. It's deeply distressing to see so many of our leaders behaving like uncivilised, egocentric boys, not men. Which brings me to tonight's speaker. And a little bit closer to Shakespeare's intent, what an extraordinary piece of work is this man. One of the chapters in his book describes the period in his young life as a teenager and young man in his 20s studying medicine who was fighting depression, contemplated suicide. He was desperate to change himself. He knew he was homosexual, but he also knew that he needed to work very hard to come up to what he thought the society of the time deemed a real man, even undergoing aversion therapy. Well, Bob Brown, to me, has always been the epitome of a real man. He is tough, he's adventurous, he's brave, he's strong, he's determined, and he's also humble, kind, reasonable, collaborative, empathetic, artistic, and spiritual. And would there were more like him in positions of power. In other words, he's a mature, well-rounded human being. His new book, Optimism, Reflections on a Life of Action, is like a box of chocolates. Thought-provoking, it's funny, it's moving, at times astonishing, a bit chewy in some parts, dark and light. And given the fight that we have on our hands to hold the boys in charge to account, Bob's mature, calm and reasonable voice is and always has been an inspiration. He describes the book as some anecdotes from a life set for downfall that found its salvation in action, and the world is a better place for that choice. In his darkest moments, he chose optimism over pessimism, and he challenges all of us, especially those who look at a picture bigger than the next couple of years and our immediate selfish gratification, to do the same. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Bob Brown.
Thanks, Noni. Thanks, everybody. I'd like to thank the Town Hall and the Wheeler Centre and Hardy Grant and you all for being here tonight. But most of all, I'd like to thank whatever it is that's got us together on this magnificent little planet Earth, which, so far as we know, amongst the trillions of planets in the universe, is the only one that sustains life and awareness and creativity and imagination and through we human beings, the ability to determine our own future, not only on the planet but in the universe. So, fellow Earthians, here is our challenge. And if we're to take up this challenge, there's no better place than here in the wealthiest country per capita in dollar terms ever to exist on the face of the planet, this Australia. And I'm, like you, lucky enough to be breathing this free air in this salubrious place, in a planet that's filled with enormous challenges. We are a herd of 7 billion mammals, and we're marauding the planet. When I came onto the planet in 1944, there were 2.5 billion of us. There's 3 times that many now, and it's predicted we'll go to 9 or 10 billion later this century before it tapers off and we start to reduce the pressure of the sheer tread of people on the planet. And if you look at the projections for population growth, they're outdone tenfold by the projections for growth of consumption if the rest of the world is going to catch up with us as it wants to in utilising the resources of the planet and in being wealthy. 300% growth in current consumption, even though currently we're using more of the living planet and its biosphere than can be replaced. That's why forests are going backwards, fisheries are collapsing, there's less arable land to feed our species, let alone other species, each morning than there ever was before in history, and the extinction of our fellow species is at the greatest rate in all of human history. And yet there's more of us to come. And the challenge for us is whether we use our God-given intelligence as a community of 7 billion people based on the ultimate democratic ideal of one person, one vote, one value on one planet, because we share a common destiny, so that we can go on into the joyride of the future, understanding more about ourselves and more about this incredible universe, which had us, our potential for life and awareness, and this remarkable creativity, as well as this destructiveness, and a sense of purpose enfolded there 13.8 billion years ago when the Big Bang occurred and this universe came into existence. And how do we know that? Because here we are. Simple as that. But never before has the situation arisen where the destiny of us on this planet is at stake. And that's the challenge, because we are in this together. And we have a choice here between whether we work it out together or whether we leave it to those driven by the religion which has the planet by the throat at the moment. This new marauding religion. And I had some to and fro with the editors at Hardy Grant about capitalising this. Just the same as Catholicism and Buddhism and the Muslim faith and so on are capitalised, so should materialism be. And the great God growth, which is part of that religion. And growth, and it's a he, I'm sure, who shall be obeyed. Because if you fail that growth, there'll be misery, unemployment, economic recession and widespread dissolution on the planet. And yet, that growth, as currently charted in consumption of the planet, simply cannot on a finite planet continue. And the question is whether we're going to use this intelligence as well as the compassionate part of our nature to turn that around, or allow it to go to its awful ultimate downfall. And whether the signs are good or not about that is a question that we have to address, and they're a mixed bag. But one thing I learnt early, and I am an opsimath, I'm learning more as I get older, but one thing I learnt early is that being depressed is to be knocked out about this. And I did sit at the edge of Lake Burley Griffin as a resident medical officer in Canberra at that hospital, where fortunately I was in with a great group of other resident doctors, many of them from the bush, who didn't know that I was secretly gay because I couldn't tell anybody, and contemplated swimming out into the lake because I knew I could get halfway across but not the full distance. And I sat there for hours in the wee hours of the morning, back at the end of 1969, and I was rescued by my family, my loved ones, and those people around me, and just the raw beauty of this planet. And bought a ticket and went to London. And there I took jobs as a roving resident, filling in here and there. And in September of 1970, found myself at St Mary Abbott's, where an extraordinary thing happened. One morning, just after 8, I was on duty, and up came a stretcher with a body on it, and it was Jimi Hendrix. And trotting behind the stretcher was his girlfriend, tall, beautiful, in her high heels, looking hopeless, as indeed we all were, because in the middle of the night, due to a cocktail of various drugs and red wine, he died. And there was nothing could be done to resuscitate him. And I thought, what have I got in common with this fellow? And I was to learn later a lot. Here was a 27-year-old genius, not just of the guitar, because that he was, but of philosophy and humanity. Jimmy described himself as a citizen of Earth, capital E. All the other planets have got capitals. Isn't it time we ascribed a capital to our own planet Earth? I insisted on that in the book as well. And he also said this besides, saying, well, he got condemned for being rude and outrageous and sexually explicit. And he said, well, whatever turns people on. But he said this, we are ultimately our children. And isn't that the most important, cogent statement upon which we human beings can work out what we should be doing? Because surely everything we do on this planet, now we know we have a common destiny, and through modern mass communications we're all in this together, should be predicated, if we want to be hopeful and optimistic human beings, on this human life going on into the future, onto the joyride into the future and exploring whatever, right out into the universe, no doubt, but so much more in our potential for creativity. And surely that ought to be across the doors of every parliament on the planet. Will people 100 years from now, and you can put brackets 1,000 or 10,000 years from now, thank us for what we're doing? And if you can't say yes to that, you ought not be doing it. And yet, that's revolutionary, because it would stop us in our tracks as far as this materialism and this rampant, short-sighted, me now rather than them later, exploitation of the planet is concerned. And I've been looking back, and no doubt very fortunate, in ending up happier at this end of life than ever before in my existence. But I spent 10 years earlier in deep depression because I was gay in a world which had a 20-year penalty and infamy and humiliation based on any uncovering as far as that was concerned. I was Presbyterian, and it said God is love, but I couldn't understand why there's such cruelty and almighty, if that's the case. And I came to the conclusion, well, two conclusions there. The first thing is, our destiny is not in the lap of the gods, it's in our own hands. It's up to us. And the second thing is that pessimism is self-defeating, but optimism is a drive for action and is a winner. Optimism wins in business. Why shouldn't it win in the business of us making this planet sure and safe right into the future? Because if we know it is, And we know our grandchildren or their great-grandchildren are going to look back at us gratefully for having turned this destructive process round in its tracks. We feel happy ourselves. And yet, there's so much going wrong on the planet. Just last year, on September the 13th last year, we voted in a government which was hell-bent on getting rid of the carbon tax. What actually happened there, ladies and gentlemen, was that Australians voted, instead of the Greens' prescription, which the Julia Gillard government put into action, of the polluters paying for the destruction of the atmosphere and the consequent global warming, which is going to be so injurious to the economy of those who comes after us. We voted to have ourselves pay the polluters. And that's what direct action, a la the Abbott government, now means. Billions of dollars of taxpayers' money going out of the citizens' pockets into the pockets of the big polluters in the hope they'll do something about it, instead of them being penalised for that pollution and paying for renewable energy. Now, somewhere in this audience tonight is my old friend Ben Oquist. I first ran into Ben down by the Picton River when we were withstanding the logging vigilantes in Tasmania's Western Wilderness in 1993. They'd been down, and amongst other things, I sat one night in the cutting, well, I was on the bridge over the Picton River, and I heard an explosion on the hill, and there was a young man and woman with me, and I said to them, run and go right back into the forest where the Greenies' camp was, because these people are dangerous. And then I went across the bridge and hid in some cutting grass myself, and the car, with gun barrels out all windows and a hunting dog whining in the back seat, came slowly across the bridge and turned round with the headlights on that piece of cutting grass, and my heart started to pound because I was sure I'd be discovered. But they didn't see me, and they turned and went back across the bridge, and then they went a little way along the track, and I knew that if my friends had gone right along the track, they'd be safe. Because bullies are often cowards, and they wouldn't go in the dark of the night into the forest, even with their hunting dog. But I heard them yell out, "Hey, look what we've found here." And I was horrified at the prospect that these two youngsters had been discovered. Instead of that, they'd found the 3 cars that were just inside the rainforest. And in the coming few minutes, there was gelignite explosions and gunshot blasts, and those cars were put to the torch, and there was an inferno which burnt a hole in the canopy of the roof of the forest. And to cut a long story short, nobody was ever taken to book over that. But some good came out of this. The forests have since been largely blitzed and destroyed. But some good did come out of this, and one of those things was I met a young student from Sydney, Ben Oquist, and Ben became my chief of staff when I went into the Senate, and his strategic nous was a main contributor, as far as I'm concerned, to the growth of the Greens' presence, which, whatever else, is a positive stimulus to discussion for social justice and the environment in our Victorian and other state and national parliaments. And here was a fella who had that strategic nous and a determination to stand up to the bullies. And just recently, strangely enough, I read in the paper, here he is negotiating with the Palmer Party. And while the Abbott government was setting fire to the green package, clean air package that Julia Gillard and I and Christine Milne and others had got through the last parliament, there was Ben instructing the Palmer Party with its furniture removal van to get some of the important goods out the back. And included in that is what Tony Abbott described as the Bob Brown Bank. Derogatory, of course, but this is a $10 billion fund which is there to finance renewable energy in this country, which is going to be, in terms of energy, the saviour of the planet against the burning of fossil fuels. And I have also, and so I'm pleased to be here with Ben, but I'm also honouring at the front of that book Rosario Godoy. Now, Rosario was a delightful character. She stood up at the funeral of Baker of a baker friend in Guatemala at the time of the right-wing death squads, killing everybody from bishops down who were progressive and wanted social justice, and said at his funeral, "Hector, you didn't die in vain," even though he'd been assassinated. And on the following Thursday, they found her body and that of her brother and that of her infant child who'd been tortured in a gutter. And I read about this and thought about it. And you know, you could be very negative about that and think, oh, well, what's the point? But Rosario is a stimulus to me. Such bravery. She was a delightful character, and she stood up against the bullies. And she might have got done in, and she won't know this, of course, but she's been a driving force for me, because people say, oh, gee, how tough is it going, Bob, being in Australian politics? And you just think about Guatemala or Argentina, and you know how easygoing it is. And really, what an extraordinary planet we live on, and what extraordinary people inhabit it. And when the best comes out of them, what great things happen. My friend Ingrid Betancourt, Green Senator for Columbia, she set the 2001 Global Greens Conference in Canberra on fire. People got to their feet, foot stamping and clapping. As she said, there's nothing short of the whole of human history, culture, heritage and life on this planet at stake. And what we're defending here are human values against the marauders, the greed, the selfishness, the violence, the vindictiveness of people who control so much of the planet at the moment. Within months, she was kidnapped at gunpoint and disappeared. She was a presidential candidate, and I flew to Bogota to help those who were left campaigning for her. The ambassador to the government said, "Don't go there, Senator Brown, it's too dangerous." But I walked down the street and there's bodyguards all over the place with a cardboard cutout of Ingrid. But she was for 6 years held in the jungle, including for some months after she tried an escape, chained by the neck to a tree. Miraculously, she was rescued after that, and she's now studying liberation theology at Oxford University. And I rang her recently to say, "Ingrid, I hear you might be standing again for the President of Colombia." And she said, "No, I've decided to wait a little on that." But in Ingrid Betancourt, this unbeatable spirit for humanity and for this planet is a beacon that in the future, the Ingrid Betancourts will be the presidents. The Ingrid Betancourts will be the leaders of a global governance. And it's Ingrid Betancourts who will head up the corporate sectors so that this planet can, with some humility, and I'm talking about we human beings on this planet, because the biosphere can do without us, but we can't do without it, will be in the shape that the best of human nature, if it's given a chance, can make happen. And here's that contradiction. How do we, who are sensitive or compassionate or caring, get beyond feeling despairing and stand up and become the arbiters of a new governance of the planet? And central to that is optimism. We have a right to it, second to none. We have the right to assert ourselves. And out of optimism comes action. Nothing will happen without action. But if you look back at the great movements of history, be it the suffragettes, who never got to see, almost none of them got to see, the universal suffrage in Britain, which didn't come till the 1930s. At the people who got kids out of the coal mines, or the people who abolished slavery, they all faced a tide of public disapproval led by those who didn't want this to intervene on their economic well-being at the time. But they had an idea whose time had come. And with their campaigning brought forward the day when what we take for granted now as a human right in all directions came into being. So is it a dream to think that we Earthians can get together and sort out through popular democracy the future of the planet? Because if we don't, we leave it to a de facto control of the planet by the militarists and the plutocrats, that is, the rich people. And they've got it at the moment, and we need to wrest it off them. And there'll be debate about this right through this century. But as Winston Churchill said in 1947, democracy is full of shortcomings, but it's better than whatever else has been tried. And this idea of global democracy goes back at least as far as Socrates. It's what Lincoln spoke about at Gettysburg. He said, this battle is so that democracy, one person, one vote, should not disappear from the earth. And this is where we're headed, ladies and gentlemen, into a future in which everybody on earth will find a formula for making sure, above all, that we service those who come after us, because in doing that we service ourselves. And of course, in that is the protection of our fellow species on this planet and the natural face of this planet, which not only gives us everything we have, including creativity, but is such a delight for we human beings. As I've said a couple of times today, what is it about wilderness flowers that, handed to another person, expresses love and devotion and delight? Why is it that if you hand them a chainsaw, it doesn't have the same effect? And you could write books on that, and it's very hard to understand it, but it's because we come out of the wild planet. We're products of it. We're bonded to it physically. And as I was saying to some youngsters today, that curl of the ear is because we could pick up the softest sound on the forest floor. And as we do unto the natural face of this planet, we do unto ourselves. And yet here we are, and I write about this towards the end of this book, because I took on the chair of Sea Shepherd Australia after I left the Senate, because although there'd been a 2008 court ruling by the Federal Court of Australia that the Japanese whaling in the sanctuary to our south was illegal, they kept doing it. Now, if you or I were to flaunt a ruling of the federal court, we'd be in contempt of court and in jail very quickly. But the Japanese whalers could continue to send their harpoons, their grenade-tipped harpoons, into the warm-blooded mammals who should be protected in that sanctuary, and we didn't do anything through our national governments to stop this illegality. So it was left to Sea Shepherd. And the Japanese went to the American courts, because they dare not come here after that court ruling, and put Sea Shepherd in America, and Captain Paul Watson, who said, I take my instructions not from any government, but from the whales themselves, out of action. So it was left to Sea Shepherd Australia, and the people of Australia rallied behind that. It took $4 million last year to send those 3 ships with 120 courageous young women and men down there to get in the way of that violent and illegal activity by the Japanese whaling fleet. And we now know, courtesy of the World Court, that globally what they're doing is illegal. This is marauding illegally the species of this planet. There's a law about it, but there's no green police. And Sea Shepherd, who've been called pirates, are effectively the de facto police force. And they've been enormously supported by the people of Australia and Europe to continue their work. And when we had Prime Minister Abe here a couple of weeks ago, the New Zealand Prime Minister chided him about whaling, but our Prime Minister, who opposed the Rudd government and Peter Garrett as Minister for the Environment taking that action, which ended up being successful in the World Court back in 2010, said nothing. Well, Australians feel differently about that. And a recent poll also found that 97% of Australians between the age of 18 and 27 didn't want Tony Abbott ripping World Heritage listing off the Tasmanian forest and leaving them to the chainsaws. But here's the dilemma. Is that what we vote for? No, we get taken up by the short term, the immediate self-interest, instead of the long term. But if we do get ourselves into thinking about the people who come after us, all that will change. much the same as the vilification of women. How could you possibly run an economy? The old fools in the House of Lords thundered 120 years ago if women had a say. How absurd was that? How absurd is it now that we have laws to protect the environment but no police to uphold them? Well, I'm about celebrating this planet, and I'm sure you are too. I'm delighted to be alive, the wonderment of being alive on this beautiful little planet of ours, which so far as we know is the only one in the universe that has this amazing life expression going on. And I'm quite determined to help through optimism, because it is such a driving force for action, stimulate that better side of us human beings who together can make sure this joyride into the future is going to continue. But it begins with celebrating ourselves, the better side of our nature, and this wonderful planet itself. One of the things I've been able to do since leaving the Senate, I wrote a song when I was 16, and it's pretty simple. Actually, I'll tell you a secret if you don't tell anybody else. It was my entry into the National Anthem contest back in 1975 or 76 under the Whitlam government. Please don't go and read the words. However, the tune was there, and since I've left the Senate, it's been my delight to put a few words of celebration to that tune about this planet and our obligation to pass it on the better to those who come after it. And that's built on the stories that are in this book, my delight at being alive and seeing what a potential we have on this planet. And down the road from us, my partner Paul, by the way, is here tonight. What a fantastic companion over the last 20 years. And what a absolute bedrock for my own optimism. Thank you, Paul. We've just been for a trip grey nomading in Western New South Wales and Queensland to the Bush Heritage properties. That was set up at Liffey back in 1990, and we hadn't got to see them. And sleeping out there under the stars, starry nights is one of the chapters. I talk about the magnificence of that sky above us. Listening to the dingoes howl. I made sure Paul was sleeping on the outside when that was going on, let alone the crocodiles further north. And but taking in the immense beauty of this country, the aboriginality of it, and what a long way we've got to go to make reparations for the first Australians, but the sheer delight of being out free by billabongs under the stars at night, in the bosom of this planet which gave us life and which nurtures us still. There's so much to celebrate there, and along the road from us is singer Claire Dawson at Eggs and Bacon Bay. She came off the West End in London, and she came to Tasmania and has her own family there. She agreed to sing it. And Mike Gissing around the way with his technological wizardry just in the last few days. Paul said, why don't we have that song? And I said, well, why not? And so, ladies and gentlemen, here is an anthem to the planet. We've got one for every country, but we don't have one for the planet itself. I'm sure better things will come along, but in the meantime, here's a song of the earth to celebrate this magnificent little planet that gives us everything we have. Thank you.
This is a planet, life's only cradle, warmed by the sunlight, it gave us birth. And in the morning, sun to our window, that magic feeling, alive on earth. Eagles are soaring above the mountains, whale songs are sounding deep in the sea, and in Earth's cities, wilderness poisonous flowers offer devotion, set spirits free. Wonderful planet, life's revelation, a sunlit garden, wild rivers fall, a one and only home in the universe, this speck of splendor. These are all. Now here's a promise, our obligation to all the people who breathe this air. Your world is our world is your world, safe in our keeping, sure in our care. Wonderful planet, life's revelation, a sunlit garden, wild rivers fall, a one and only home in the universe, this speck of splendor. These are all.
You have to say that music, great literature, great art, rebounds on nature and is part of the protection of this, lifting of the mood of people to protect this planet. I always remember the dictum of Emma Goldman, the socialist revolutionary of the 1880s and 90s in Chicago, was trying to get women out of the sweatshops, who turned to her fellow workers and said, "I don't want your revolution if I can't dance." And young people say to me, "Oh, Bob, why aren't you pessimistic?" And I say, well, you know, if you are pessimistic, it's because you're saddled with intelligence. And it's a responsible reaction to the way the planet is. It's a reasonable reaction. It's a reactive depression. But you have to put the things you can't fix on the shelf and get on with those things that you can. And along the way, don't get too anxious about there not being time. There will be time. Or we might as well go home and read a book. And take on those things where you can make a change. You don't have to be. Well, they're bringing in laws while we're here. It's gone through the lower house of the Tasmanian Parliament, and it's pretty certain to go through the upper house, that in future, a lot of those pictures were of the Tarkine wilderness, so threatened by logging and mining in Tasmania. If you go to stand peaceably in front of a chainsaw going into those ancient forests, you'll be mandatorily given a $5,000 sentence. The judge has got no option. And if you do it again, it'll be 3 months in jail. These are penalties that don't apply to violent crime, but they are being levied by those who would violate the planet to protect that violation against those of us who would stand in defence of the planet. And stand we will. And in the chapter I've written about the amazing white goshawk with her pulverising red eye, who flies through the canopy of the forest in Tasmania like a snowflake horizontally, down to some hundreds of breeding pairs and dependent on those forests. The question is, will we stand with amazing species like that, or will we allow the chainsaws to simply go in because it appears to us it's all too hard? And I make that commitment to the white goshawks in those forests. If they invoke these penalties and they continue to destroy globally significant forests, I'll be there, whatever the penalties may be. The same applies to the highlands here in Victoria, where the state emblem, for goodness sake, leadbeater's possum, this amazing thing that was thought to be extinct, this fellow mammal of ours, is in the onrush. David Lindenmayer, the greatest expert on this animal on the planet from ANU, tells us it'll be extinct in the wild within 20 years unless the logging of the last couple of percent of the tall forests, the mountain ash in Victoria's Central Ranges, is stopped. Is Melbourne in revolution about that? I think not. And I quote the poet Drew Dillinger, the American poet, who says it's 3:23 in the morning and I'm awake and I can't sleep because my great-grandchildren are saying to me, when democracy was usurped, what did you do? And they're saying to me, when the planet was marauded, did you make a stand? And that, I think, sums it up again. The words of Jimi Hendrix, we are our children, and through their spirit we can be vitalised. Nobody else is going to be able to come back and do what we can do. Nobody's going to be so advantaged as we Australians are in being able to get up and make a stand for the natural world and for fairness within the human community on it, which is absolutely essential to our well-being as we go into the centuries ahead. It's not only a challenge to us, I think it's the most exciting thing going. So I got out of the Senate and a phenomenal suite. I spoke with Adam Bant today, Christine Milne's there. We've got our other Victorian and other senators and other good-hearted people in other parties. Had my turn at that. I'm a bird out of the cage, and I'm now working in the service of the best employer of all, and that's this magnificent planet Earth. I feel great about that. It's great to be talking with you about it tonight. It's lovely to have been able to write a book called Optimism, which aims in that direction. And I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you will, in your turn, consider in this choice whether we be pessimistic and knocked out or whether we be optimistic and active. And I can assure you that in my experience, the second's the better choice. Let's go. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.